Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give people a moment to filter in to our inaugural Journeys in Jewish Studies webinar featuring Ori Yehudai. One second. Excellent. Oh, it's so great to see some old friends and new faces. Okay, let's begin. Okay. Why won't they stay here? In September 1945, mere months following the genocide of Jewish people during the Holocaust, 3 years before the modern state of Israel's declaration of independence out of what was then dubbed British Palestine, 4 years before Israel's official admission to the United Nations, a columnist for the Hebrew language newspaper Hatzofer, The Observer, raised some penetrating questions about an emerging phenomenon at the time. A number of Jews who had newly found refuge in the region of Israel began migrating out from there to Europe and the Americas. Today, we'll reanimate Hatzofer's question, why won't they stay here? And expand our understandings of post-Holocaust Jewry and Israel's founding. Welcome to our inaugural Journeys in Jewish Studies event, fellow Maroons. We hope you enjoyed this glimpse into the interdisciplinary field of Jewish studies. Our featured scholar today is Ori Yehudai, an alumnus of the MA PhD program in UChicago's History Department, and presently the Saul and Sonia Schot Chair in Israel Studies and Associate Professor in the Department of History at the Ohio State University. He is the author of Leaving Zion, Jewish Emigration from Palestine and Israel After World War II. My name is Josh Levitt. I'm an alumnus of the college at UChicago and a PhD alumnus of Ohio State. I am delighted to welcome Ori and serve as your host for this hour of lunchtime learning. Today is fitting for our discussion. It is the Jewish holiday of Tu B'Shvat, also known as Chag HaYolanot, or the New Year of Trees. This is an occasion for Jews to contemplate human relationships with land, relationships that have been quite fraught, and particularly in the period that Ori specializes in. As our conversation unfolds, please feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat. We'll try to cover as many as possible. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, Ori, thanks again for joining us. Let's start with, let's begin at the beginning, as they say. How would you say the University of Chicago figured in your career journey, professionally as well as personally? You ventured to Hyde Park from Kibbutz Shamir by way of Tel Aviv. Let's pull up that map of the region. Let's see. It's all the way in northern Israel there. There's Kibbutz Shamir. So facetiously speaking, why didn't you stay there?
Okay, thank you, Josh, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Why didn't I stay there? So I left Israel to Chicago, and I started the graduate program in history in Chicago in 2006, and so when I started applying to graduate school, I was finishing my MA in history in Tel Aviv, and I didn't really have clear plans for my future. I was working at the time as a driver in a sort of a shipping company in Tel Aviv, but I knew that that I enjoyed studying history, that I was attracted to the intellectual life. So PhD seemed like a natural continuation of what I was doing at the time. And I don't think I left Israel because I didn't want to live in Israel. And also I don't think that I thought it was I think that I believe it would be temporary. I don't think I imagined that I would become a professor in the United States. But then when I entered this path, things started moving slowly in that direction. And yeah, and you also asked about my experience in Chicago, the University of Chicago. So yeah, so it had an immense influence on my career, on my life. I was initiated into academia, socialized into academia at the University of Chicago. I became a scholar. This is where I became a scholar, a historian. It was, of course, thanks largely to my amazing and wonderful mentors and teachers at the University of Chicago. As a historian, this is where I wrote my first real research paper, the first paper where I developed a historical narrative, historical argument based on primary documents. So this is what we do as historians. So I did that first at a seminar paper at the University of Chicago, which was a very formative intellectual experience. And then, of course, my dissertation, which later developed into my book. So this was definitely a very formative experience, both professionally and personally in Chicago.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I was wondering, could you tell us a little more about the different skills that you had to develop, in order really to enter this field?
Yeah, so it's first of all reading a lot. In history, you have to read a lot, both what we call secondary sources, which are works of other historians, books and articles of other historians, but also primary sources, which are various documents produced by the historical actors at the time of the event. So various types of documents, and I learned how to read all those types of documents to do a critical reading of the documents and collect them and try to see how I can write a story, write a narrative based on those documents. And writing, improving my writing, telling the story in a clear and engaging manner. I think those were some of the things that I started learning as a graduate student. Then I also continued working with them after graduating and after turning my PhD dissertation into a book. So I would say mainly working with sources and learning to ask questions, maybe new questions about history, questions that have not been asked previously, and trying to develop to provide interesting and sophisticated answers to simple questions.
Yeah, I think it's a humble way of actually articulating what seems to be the essence of your recent book, Leaving Zion, is exploring historical narratives, asking familiar questions in an unfamiliar way, asking unfamiliar questions in a familiar way, so on, absolutely grappling with historical narrative. I'm going to drop a link to the book in the chat here. But I wonder if you could tell us what was your experience writing this book?
Yeah, it was a great experience. It started with very extensive research in archives, collecting all those materials. So I did research in more than 20 archives in 6 countries. So this was actually, I think, maybe the most enjoyable part of the project. Gave me an opportunity to travel to nice places, like actually moved to New York from Chicago to start the research, and then I went to Paris, London, obviously Israel, Toronto, some places in Germany. So this was very it was fun, it was interesting, and also the experience of doing research in archives, finding new exciting materials, exciting documents, I would say this was my favorite part of the whole process. And then also Writing. I mean, when you see the actual results, when you put those all those documents into, when you organize them into a story, this is also a very satisfying, I would say, satisfying intellectual experience. So overall, the working on the project was a nice experience. I mean, I was lucky to get financial support from University of Chicago, from the Center for Jewish Studies, from the History Department, also some external fellowships. So I was privileged to have those resources, which allowed me to to dedicate time to this research and writing, and to travel to all those places. So I mean, so I would add that to my experience, my Chicago experience.
That's refreshing to hear, since sometimes writers can certainly develop a love-hate relationship with their own projects, especially as they get immersed in them. So that's really refreshing to hear. On the flip side, like what have you hoped would be people's experience reading Leaving Zion?
So I mean, there are several things of the book. Maybe for people who don't know about the
Yeah,
book,
tell us.
maybe I should say that it's about Jewish outmigration from Palestine and Israel between 1945 and the early 1950s. So Palestine, before it became Israel in 1948. So this period immediately after the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and then through the first decade of Israeli independence. So the book is about the stories of people who went to Palestine during those years or earlier, and then rather than staying there, they decided to leave the country and settle in other places. So I'm looking at the personal experiences of all those people, of the migrants themselves. What motivated them to leave, what were the obstacles that they faced when they tried to emigrate. It was very difficult actually to emigrate for various reasons. What happened to them after arriving to their new destinations. And then there's a different level of narrative which looks at the public side of the story. Looking at immigration policies in Israel and in countries of destination, and also the discourse, the reactions, the public reactions, what people said and wrote about immigrants. The public debate surrounding immigration. So and the book shows that. So this is also the argument, the historical argument, that a lot has been written on Jewish immigration into Israel. We all know that. So this is the sort of the conventional narrative, the more familiar narrative. But I show that there were tens of thousands of people who actually left the country, who did not want to live in Israel, despite the general notion that Jews should live in Israel, that displaced Jews should immigrate to Israel. So I show that many people saw Israel as a sort of a site of displacement, a place of exile even, and a transit station, towards other countries, which they thought were seemed more desirable. So one of the conclusions that I'm hoping people would take from this book is that Israel was not only a country of Jewish immigration, but also of emigration, and that we should look at the personal stories of immigrants, of migrants, of people generally, not only at the more national, familiar story. Look at cases, historical examples where people are acting against the expectations of the community, of the national community. And another interesting and important point, I think, is also about the ability of individuals to act against the expectations of the community, because there was a lot of pressure on those people. Maybe we can talk about it later. A lot of criticism and pressure on those people demanding that they would stay in Israel, and a lot of practical hardships. But the fact that so many people left the country tells us something not only about the role of Zionist ideology in this critical period after the Second World War, but also about the ability of individuals to act against the expectations of the community, against institutional and ideological pressures.
Yes, I wanna dive into that in a moment. But I guess to further contextualize, about how long would you say that period of emigration lasted? From the 40s through the 1950s, 1960s. When does it really taper off?
Yeah, so I studied the period between 1945 and the late 1950s, but
Mhm.
obviously people continued to emigrate even after that period. But when you write a book, you have to make it, to make it manageable. You have to
Right.
set a certain period of time. But in my case, it was logical because I wanted to capture this very dramatic period of the transition from the end of the Holocaust and the Second World War to the creation of Israel, and then to the formative period of the first years of Israeli independence, which was also a period of massive immigration into Israel, which took place during the early years of the state. So obviously immigration continued until today. I mean, also obviously even today people continue to immigrate from Israel. But I mean, I think it's an interesting question in terms of the individual experience. We can ask when did immigration ended for a specific person. So I mean, officially it could be maybe the moment when you settled in a new country. But then obviously it's not only that. There's also the period of adjustment, of starting to live the new, getting adjusted to the new life in a new country, and dealing with memories and sort of developing your thoughts and ideas about the old place and the new place. And sometimes people went back to Israel and then emigrated again. So there was a lot of back and forth movement. And I think, I mean, I have some examples of people who said or wrote or said decades after immigrating from Israel, that they still feel strong connection to Israel. Some people, one woman said she went to New York from Israel in 1950s, and then she stayed in New York, but she said this was the most terrible mistake I had done in my life. So she felt this strong connection to Israel, and even though she did not go back, she still felt that she belonged in Israel. So I mean, maybe for her, immigration, the period of immigration lasted until her last day. So I think it's the different answers for different people. I mean, depending on the individual experience.
Yeah, I think that like nicely complexifies that question and that answer. And so we're curious though. See some questions in the chat. Just for that period in which in which you specialize. What proportion though of the people who left were Ashkenazi Jews, and what portion were Mizrahi Jews?
Interesting. Yeah, so I have a section in the book,
Mm-hmm.
a whole section about this question of Mizrahi versus Ashkenazi Jews emigrating, about 10 pages maybe even more. So the numbers, statistically, the vast majority were Ashkenazi Jews who came from Europe. I mean, I have to read the book again, but I think about 70% of the immigrants were Ashkenazim. Some were native born. I mean, some were born in Israel. Some were the majority were immigrants who became immigrants, but the majority were people from European countries, were Ashkenazim. Even though the immigrants into Israel were I mean, it was about 50-50. I mean, about 50% of the immigrants who came to Israel were. I mean, actually, it was a small, I think, even a small majority of Mizrahi Jews who came to Israel during the 1950s, but the majority were Ashkenazim. And I mean, we can say a little more about that if you want, trying to expand that. I mean, the question was about numbers, but I can also.
No, absolutely. Yeah, just to give a sense of within Jewish communities, what what were the different motivations or the different perspectives on this, on this pattern of immigration?
Yeah, so
Is
the
that what you're-
motivations were quite similar because most immigrants were motivated by, I would say, material, personal reasons, not ideological reasons, mostly. Problems of employment in Israel, housing, generally economic conditions, health problems. Many of the people were, they were refugees. Many of them were survivors of, genocide, and the climate was very difficult for them. They were very hot for them, very hot in Israel. No air conditioning, no air conditions at the time in Israel. So, which made some health problems even more difficult. Language problems, and then the desire to reunite with family in other countries, relatives in other countries. So mostly those kinds of economic, material, personal reasons rather than ideological reasons. And this was true for both Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews. Even though Mizrahim suffered more discrimination, obviously, than Ashkenazi Jews, Ashkenazim also emigrated because of those, material difficulties. But it's interesting. I mean, I said earlier that more Ashkenazim left than Mizrahim. So it was partly because of opportunities for immigration. So most of the people who immigrated from Israel went to the Americas, went to the United States and to Canada. And because of previous Jewish migrations to those countries, it was easier for Ashkenazi Jews to immigrate to those places than for Mizrahi Jews, because immigration to the United States and to Canada depended on sponsorship from family members. You needed to have a family relative who would invite you or sponsor you, and you provide an affidavit, it was called, and some forms, documents confirming that they would take care of the immigrant. So because of earlier migrations in the early 20th century, already late 19th century, from Eastern Europe to the United States and Canada, there were more Ashkenazi Jews in those countries who could invite and sponsor immigrants from Israel. So I would say this was the main reason, even though it's also interesting that at least in the earlier years, so I would say from 1948 to 1951, the early 1950s, when you look at return migration, you look at immigration from Israel back to the country of origin, rather than not to the United States or to a new country, then you see that there were more Mizrahi Jews who returned to the country of origin than Ashkenazi Jews. So more Iraqi Jews, actually not Iraqi Jews, sorry, more Moroccan Jews or Jews from other North African countries returned to the countries of origin than Jews from Poland or from Romania, which was related to the political conditions in those countries. So it's a very complicated story with many factors and elements, but generally more Ashkenazi Jews emigrated.
Yeah. This is just it's a fascinating topic in any way. One that I'm kind of personally invested in as well. When my father's side of the family came to the United States and established themselves, what did they do? They set up an immigration firm that's still operating in New York. On my mother's side, they also came to New York City. They had always kind of kept an eye on like those early years and those and those and conflicts, particularly during the 60s and 70s, to see if Israel would stay established after it was officially established and so on, and always kind of like kept an eye on it in case they decide to make Aliyah and settle roots, back there in Israel. And my Chicago roommates for the first 2 years, he himself had made Aliyah shortly after convocation. So it's just a topic that's top of mind, movements in and out from the region and so on. But let's I want to like to go back to that last thing you were saying though about about those early early or those mid 20th century residents, those who went back not necessarily to Morocco, but who were, going back to Poland, to the what was then Czechoslovakia, so on. That column that I had quoted earlier, that you noted in your book, that column seemed flummoxed, that Jews journeyed, as the line read, from the land of Israel back into the lion's den. So I guess that, to adapt the classic title by Moses ben Maimon or Maimonides, be our guide for the perplexed. What underlay various reactions to people's emigration to in the regional press? What underlay the various reactions there?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion in the book about reactions in the press and other other media, and the book indeed shows that immigration was seen as a threat to in Israel. It was seen as a threat to the success of Zionism, the success of the Zionist project, and that immigrants challenged central convictions, central beliefs in the Jewish world. First, that Israel should be a country of immigration and not immigration. Jews should go into Israel rather than go from Israel to other places, and that Israel, first Palestine and Israel, should be the main destination for the rehabilitation of Jewish life after the war, Jewish individual and collective life after the war, after the Second World War, after the Holocaust. Now we have to remember that even more broadly, the entire realization of Zionism, or the Zionist project, was dependent on Jewish immigration into Israel. Right? Immigration was a necessary component of Zionist ideology. It was impossible to fulfill the Zionist goals without bringing or encouraging people to go to Israel. Another important dimension of that, sort of more ideological, even cultural element, was the Zionist concept of the rejection of exile. It's called, so a very basic idea in Zionist thinking, classical Zionist thinking, the rejection of exile. The notion that Jews cannot live in other countries, that Jewish life, Jewish existence in foreign lands was dangerous, was humiliating, was unviable, right? Because of both of assimilation, the threat of assimilation, which would bring an end to Jewish culture, but also, of course, because of the physical threat of anti-Semitism, of pogroms, of anti-Jewish violence. So there was this notion that there was no future for the Jews in Israel, and those issues became even more urgent, more serious after 1945, after the end of the Second World War. The immigration to Israel after 1945 represented this very dramatic transition from genocide to national revival, right? From helplessness in Europe and also in the Muslim world. For helplessness to power, to national power, national success in Israel. And so immigration, the fact that people were moving out of the country during that period seemed to cast doubt on all those beliefs, on all those basic beliefs in Zionist ideology, later in Israeli national collective consciousness. So the result was that immigrants faced very serious social pressure, denunciations. They were called traitors. They were seen as weak people who could not withstand the difficulties of pioneering life in Israel, of living in Israel. People who were blind to the political reality that the Jews should live in Israel. So in addition to those attacks, verbal attacks in the press, There were also attempts to prevent the movement. The government actually tried to stop people from moving, not by making immigration illegal, but by introducing various technical, I would say, administrative steps and restrictions on immigration. So yeah, on the one hand,
bureaucratic wall. Yeah.
Sorry.
All right, a sort of bureaucratic wall.
Right. Yeah. And it was also also bureaucratic obstacles in countries of destination. So it was a very, very difficult process. It's not just the decision to leave and then deciding to leave and then you pick up, you buy a ticket and you start new lives in other countries. There were in the book I show the process of immigration. There's a lot of emphasis on the process itself, which involved getting stuck in various places on the way. So people who wanted to go to the United States, they had to go through Europe because of various bureaucratic technical reasons. And then they got stuck there. They lost all their money. They had no legal status. So many of them actually went back to live in refugee camps, in displaced persons camps in Germany, because they got stranded in Europe. This was started on their way to America. This is a big part of the book. Showing that people who were survivors of the Holocaust, who lived in displaced persons in camps, refugee camps in Germany after the war, before going to Israel, they wanted to go back, wanted to leave Israel, and part of the process of emigrating was going back to live in those refugee camps in Germany after the war. So very surprising trajectories and directions of movement, unexpected, but also basically a very difficult process, which is also interesting because there was this notion which I mentioned earlier that people who left the country did so because they were not strong enough, they were too weak to live in Israel. So there was this notion of mental and physical weakness that caused people to leave Israel. But when you look at the experiences of those immigrants and what they had to go through in order to emigrate and reach a new destination, I think actually the conclusion would be that they're actually some of them were quite strong people.
Yes.
Opposed to this image of immigrants as weak people.
Yes, and just as a little preview, our next Journeys in Jewish Studies actually will take out exactly that issue of embodiment and look at the life of a queer disabled Zionist. So on. It's in an upcoming talk. So that dovetails quite nicely with what you're describing. I want to turn to a couple questions in the chat. Thank you so much. Ruth Leitner, it's a pleasure to hear from you. Notes the linguistics as well as the symbolism and so on of participating in this historical narrative, in this social political reality. Ruth notes that the word for immigrating in Hebrew is aliyah, or ascending, and that the word for emigrating is yerida, right, or going down. And we still use those terms today. And and she notes that no doubt those words, that terminology, creates a great deal of probably create a great deal of social pressure, probably particularly in the kibbutz culture. So I was wondering, or rather the question is, to what extent did that formulation factor into this moment that you analyze? And to what extent maybe do you relate to it personally or professionally?
Yeah, it's a very good point. The terms, the words are part, they represent the basic approach, the basic idea to immigration, right? Describing immigration to Israel as a movement upwards, going up.
Right. We say in and out, but that language is actually up and down. Yeah, right.
Yeah, moving into Israel is going up, going to a higher place, and then moving out of Israel is going to a lower place. Those words were used actually already in the 1920s, 1930s. Already, even before the establishment of Israel. So people started using those words. I mean, obviously, aliyah, immigration, was an earlier word, but I'm talking mainly about yerida as a word describing emigration. So people started using yerida already in the 1920s when Zionist ideology became more influential, began to crystallize in the British Mandate period. But then it became much more popular in the 1940s, 1950s, when immigration became a very critical issue in the Zionist struggle, right? When there was a struggle to bring the Jewish refugees from Europe during the Holocaust, especially after the Holocaust. So immigration became sort of the center of the Zionist struggle, and then emigration, moving in the opposite direction, seemed to be like a greater threat. So and then yerida became more popular, and then it became even more popular in the 1950s, 1960s, and so on. I think that then there was a change around the 1980s, 1990s. Israeli society became more open towards the idea that people could live in other places, and specifically towards the idea of Jewish immigration from Israel. So then people started using more, I would say, more neutral terms like aziva, living, or hagira, emigration. Even though people still used yerida or yorudim, other less ideologically charged words became a bit more popular, part of the discourse. So the language reflects we know, right? The language reflects ideas and ideology. So what was the other part of the question? I think there was
no, exactly right. Just exactly what you're describing, and then to what extent
on my
you,
so on my it's also a good question. So I don't use those words in the book, yerida or aliyah. I use immigration and emigration, because I do not want to impose ideological concepts on the on the historical actors. It's interesting that there is no. So we know that aliyah and yerida are Zionist terms, right? Ideological terms. So there is no neutral, non-ideological term in Hebrew for immigration and also for emigration, right? There is, those of you, I don't know how many of people here speak Hebrew, so hagira is the Hebrew word for migration, but it does not indicate the movement, the direction of movement, right? Hagira, so hagira could be hagira from, hagira to, as opposed to in English, where you have immigration, which is moving into a place, and emigration, which is moving out of a place, from a place. So in Hebrew, so one of the reasons people used aliyah and yerida was not only the ideological meaning of those terms, but also because it was more comfortable. There were no other words which provided that meaning of moving, of immigration and emigration. But in my book, to answer the question again, I'm using immigration and emigration because I do not want to again to impose those ideological concepts on the migrants, on the historical actors. Even though, I mean, maybe some would say that my refusal to use those words is also an ideological decision. So I'm
double bind.
open to this criticism.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we talked history and language, and we gesture a little bit toward law, but let's expand that based on, I'm inspired by a question that Chaim Shafab posted here in the chat. Great to see you again. So I guess a question is, like, were there any significant numbers, for instance, of Haredi Jews from that old issue, from the from the region, who left after 1948 because maybe they didn't want to live in the Jewish state or the modern Jewish state? And we know that I mentioned Moses Maimonides earlier, that he had argued or asserted that really only permitted to emigrate and resettle abroad in cases of like hunger. So from that standpoint of Judaic law, how did that factor or not factor into this?
Yeah, I have to, it's a very interesting question, but I have to say that I did not encounter, not see any, significant religious discourse
Interesting.
around immigration. Um, I I do not have, statistics about the number of ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews or Haredim among the immigrants. But I suspect that the lack of, I mean, maybe I didn't find just, I didn't look in, because I didn't look in the right places, but I suspect that the lack of extensive, religious rhetoric, religious discussion, testifies to the fact that it was not a major issue. I don't think that there were many ultra-Orthodox Jews who were part of that immigration. I mean, yeah, I would say just I didn't see a very elaborate discourse on that question.
It sounded like there were other factors that were overriding,
Yeah.
perhaps.
I mean, in terms of the connection between immigration and religion was another interesting an interesting aspect to that. Actually, of people who converted to Christianity in order to emigrate from Israel, because in Israel there were missionary groups, Christian missionary groups, who promised to assist immigration, to give people visas and to help them financially to sponsor immigration for Jews who would convert to Christianity. So there was a movement of, it wasn't a very massive phenomenon, but several hundred people, maybe even more, who converted to Christianity. They became Christians, and they were baptized in Christian institutions in Israel in order to receive material and legal assistance from Christian groups, helping them to move to other countries like Brazil and Canada and other places. So this was another dimension of the question of the connection between religious and religion and immigration. So a movement away not only from Israel but also from Judaism. But I would say that it's an interesting case of religious conversion motivated not by theological considerations or religious considerations, but by material, personal reasons.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. We're gonna shift the gears a little bit now to comparisons and analogies. So one of our alumni friends notes, that during the late 1970s, following the Yom Kippur War, there was another peak, say, for emigration from the region. To what extent are those two moments similar? To what extent are those different in terms of your framing of the phenomenon?
Yes. So I would say that in the 1950s, on the one hand, it was seen as a greater threat to Israel, and because of the historical context, the immediate context of the creation was the struggle to create a state, and the recent experience of the Holocaust, again, and the notion of Israel as a place of refuge for people who were expelled or were forced to leave their homes in Europe and in the Muslim world. So I think it was more shocking that people would leave the country in the 1950s. So this was the main reason for these types of very negative reactions to immigration in the 1950s. The historical context of the struggle to create a state after those catastrophes that the Jews experienced in other places. But an interesting difference is that in the 1950s, the majority of immigrants were not native-born Israelis, not people who were born in Israel or Palestine, but immigrants, mainly new immigrants who would come to Israel and then they left the country. And then in the 1970s, more and more people, more and more immigrants were native-born, Tzabarim, Sabras, people who were born in Israel, which was also another reason, for concern. Because I mean, one could say it is natural that people who just came to the country would now live in other to settle in other countries. But if native-born people are immigrating, this is a reason to be concerned, because they're not just immigrants who just came here a year ago or 2 months ago. They're people who were born in this country, and they should be more connected to the land, connected to the country. So this is a reason to be concerned. So I would say, so just to conclude that that answer, from the perspective of historical context of the period itself, in the 1950s, immigration was greater reason for concern because of the struggle to create the state around that period. But in terms of the identity and the background of immigrants in the 1970s, people were worried about the fact that many of them were native-born rather than new immigrants.
Excellent. And I guess maybe let's move out even further. What are some of the common, perhaps like misconceptions about Zionism itself that you hoped to have addressed in Leaving Zion, and perhaps in your scholarly journey and teaching now?
So you mean my current work?
Well, say, yeah, in your current work, in your current scholarship and teaching, and just as a professor on U.S. college campus, what are some of the perhaps like conceptions, misconceptions about Zionism that you've addressed in this book, and that you're addressing, in your work now?
Yeah, so now I'm doing a different project, which is I took a totally different direction. Not studying migration now. I'm studying Israeli-Palestinian violence. There's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
So after the Yom Kippur 1973 war, so there was several attacks, several terrorist attacks by Palestinians in settlements in Israel, including my own kibbutz in 1974. So I wrote an article, did research and wrote an article specifically on the attack on my kibbutz in 1974. And I'm looking at not the military aspect of that, but the more social, cultural aspects, looking at how the reactions in Israel to the terrorism were related to social and ethnic tensions in Israel, specifically tensions between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, because there were, in addition to the attack on my kibbutz, there were also attacks on communities and cities which were mainly inhabited by Mizrahi Jews. So there were different interesting reactions that explored, or that placed an emphasis on the difference between an Ashkenazi kibbutz community and a non-kibbutz Mizrahi community, and how they responded to those violent attacks. So now I'm interested in those questions, in the impact of violence on Israeli society, and its connections to social, ethnic, cultural issues, the discourse that developed around Palestinian violence and the Palestinian question generally in the 1970s, but also the reactions of American Jews to the violence in the 1970s. So various aspects of this period of the 1970s in terms of design.
I'm curious, what sort of sources are you consulting for that project, and how do they compare with the sort of sources that you explored you have explored already?
Yeah, so I'm looking a lot at newspapers, which I also used quite extensively in my book, newspapers. But here I'm also, and also some official documents. But here in this project, also looking at local archives, which is interesting because I mean those were attacks on communities in Israel. So I'm looking at the archives of those communities, smaller archive than the larger archives that I used in my book, and also did some interviews because I'm studying the 1970s, and some people who were active in that period are still available for interviews. So this is another sort of resources that I'm using. Wow, sorry for this noise.
Yeah. That's all right. Well, I guess we're wrapping up anyway. You're in your campus office. Well, we know that I do appreciate that glimpse into what you're working on now. And we know that you Chicago alumni respond well to a syllabus. So what would you recommend your fellow Maroons read, watch, or listen to next in the realm of Jewish studies or beyond?
Yeah, so actually, I would not recommend scholarly book or article.
Yeah.
I want to recommend the novel The Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen,
Oh,
which I read over the summer.
it's just funny. I'm literally in the middle of it right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. We did not plan this. Yeah, I thought I enjoyed it a lot. I think it's a smart, funny book. It's about academic life, but also about interesting intellectual historical questions about Zionism, about the connection between Israel and the diaspora, which is also relevant to my to my book. So I think it's a smart, interesting book, well written. I read the Hebrew translation actually, but
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I would definitely recommend this book.
Yes. I'll drop a link in the chat for everybody. This is Joshua Cohen's novel, The Netanyahus, an account of a minor and ultimately even negligible episode in the history of a very famous family. It won the 2022 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I'm gonna put that in the chat right there in case you're curious. That's a great recommendation for a portrait of Jewish American life, of American Israeli dynamics, and also, as you said, like as a campus novel, it's also like an interesting just like history and satire and everything else. Hard to categorize the genre of the sort of scholarship that you're producing. That's a great that's a great recommendation. I appreciate it. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and also take a moment that we can hear everything. And I want to thank Ori Yehudai for making the time to speak with us. I want to thank UChicago Masters alumnus and New Books Network podcaster Ari Barbalat for ideating this series. Ari, I see your hand is raised, so I'm gonna click allow to talk if you want to share a few words.
If you could hear me, I wanted to thank both Josh and Ori for a marvelous conversation today. Ori, you were incredibly erudite and eloquent in all the knowledge and wisdom you shared. And Josh, you were extremely considerate and caring in your approach to the conversation and the tone and content of your questions. I could not be more grateful to both of you.
My goodness. Well, again, we really appreciate you, Ari, for recommending this. And I want to thank the team in alumni engagement for providing this virtual venue And I want to thank all of you tuning in, the Maroon Mishpacha, the family, for tuning in and being a part of our UChicago community. When this session closes, you can not only share your experience today, but also suggest future topics. As I mentioned earlier, Journeys in Jewish Studies continues during Passover when critical theorist and UChicago Divinity School alumna Sarah Imhoff encourages us to think about, as she has written, quote, how embodiment makes religious meaning and how religious discourse makes bodies. I will include a link in the chat momentarily. I have also launched a WhatsApp group for alumni in Israel. If you're based there or plan to visit, please feel free to join the channel. And finally, you can find more opportunities to explore career journeys with fellow Maroons at alumni-and-friends.uchicago.edu. Those links are all there for you to enjoy. And as I said, my name is Josh Levitt. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime at jbleavitt@uchicago.edu. Enjoy the rest of your Tu B'Shvat or Chag HaIlanot today, and have a marvelous week. Take care.
Thank you very much, Josh, and thanks everyone for attending.